Hello and shalom. My name is Donovan Forrest. I'm a member at CRC. I'm a black gay Jew, and I'm going to talk to you about environmental racism, environmental justice, especially in light of the month we're in, this holy month of Elul, where we're approaching the Day of Atonement, where we're supposed to make any wrongs that exist right. So this video is Shma. It's video series that Rabbi Randy has gotten us all together for, and I know in this time we want to see everyone's face, but the content that I want to talk about, I think it's important. So in the tradition of the Shma, where we usually close our eyes and block out the outside world so we can hear and feel the words that are spoken, I would like to do the same. So hopefully somewhere around here I'm gonna go bye-bye and you'll see some stuff on the screen. So let's get into environmental racism. This is not an idea, it's a fact that environmental hazards disproportionately affect people of color. And while people of color tend to be poorer, mostly in part due to other forms of institutionalized racism and structural racism, race seems to trump class. Even middle-income African Americans are more likely to live in polluted neighborhoods. In fact, one study shows that African Americans who make between $60,000 and $70,000 a year are more likely to suffer than whites making just $10,000 a year. And we've all heard stories about the impacts of environmental racism around the country. Flint, Michigan, and their water crisis. The Standing Rock Sioux, where their tribe, where they're fighting against the installation of the Keystone Pipeline, which threatened their water supply. And more recently, the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository, which is an effort to store nuclear waste in a mountain which is in close proximity to other native tribes. But what about here in St. Louis? In St. Louis, black kids are 2.4 times as likely to test positive for lead than their white counterparts, and they make up 70% of all lead positive children. Black kids are also 10 times more likely to visit the emergency room because of asthma than white children. Most illegal trash dumping occurs in majority black neighborhoods, and 90% of the vacant properties that exist in the city of St. Louis are in these African American neighborhoods. And these issues cause each other, and they have implications: decreased health, decreased quality of life, and increased poverty. Poorly maintained rental houses increase the energy burden, or the amount that people have to pay to keep their houses cooled and heated. They increase lead and mold exposure. Vacant buildings in the city are ripe with illegal dumping. These issues in St. Louis exist in large part due to the Delmar Divide. In 2000, we were recognized as the 7th most segregated city, and during the period of 2003 to 2017, we held that title more than we did the World Series champion. So St. Louis has in the past used its planning and zoning powers not only to enforce segregation, but also to confine African Americans to areas with greater environmental and health risks, near industrial and polluting facilities, near highways, etc. They've also used, the city has also used urban development and code enforcement to focus its efforts on lessening these issues in majority white areas, but not majority black areas. So let's talk about some of these issues in detail. Let's talk about lead. Black kids are almost two and a half times more likely to test positive for lead. In the 1980s, lead paint was banned for use in houses. Most houses in Missouri were built before 1980. However, for some reason, wards with similar housing ages pre-1980s have different lead positive rates along racial lines. And that's because building maintenance and unsafe housing is more of an issue in areas where African Americans are predominant. Lead poisoning can lead to permanent brain damage and behavioral disorders. While there is no safe lead exposure, there are times when there's still what's called an acceptable lead level. In fact, I have a cousin who, as a child, I think he was about 6 years old, he tested many times higher than that acceptable lead level, that threshold that the city determined to be acceptable. Asthma, eczema, and allergies, these are also issues that plague the Black and brown community of St. Louis. Mold and air pollution coupled with inadequate access to health care spells disasters for our most vulnerable citizens. African Americans account for more ER hospitalizations, overall about 8.5 times as much as other races, and for children that's 10.8 or 11 times as many ER visits for asthma. Although asthma is life-threatening, it can be easily managed with good medical care. The problem is that a lot of people in our city lack access to health care. There aren't a lot of local clinics in North St. Louis. There are urgent cares, and that's about it. The parents of these children often work 2 or 3 jobs, and they don't. And as crazy as it sounds, they don't have the ability or the luxury of taking off from work to get routine preventative healthcare screenings for their children. Additionally, they might not have money to afford the upkeep, so buying the inhalers or the breathing machines, as they're sometimes called. Mold. In areas where there were 6 or more interior mold complaints, 70% of those wards were majority African American. Then we have air pollution. Since the 70s, African Americans have been exposed to harmful air pollutants that are below federal standards. Right? The factories and highways near their neighborhoods, the demolitions of these vacant properties we talked about, which may have asbestos, mold, and lead. One recent example would be the Gateway School Complex. They've been reporting higher asthma and breathing problems, and this can be attributed to the demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex to make room for the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Also interesting about the Pruitt-Igoe complex, it was the site of Army experiments in which they put fans on top of the rooftops and sprayed chemicals that they planned on using during wartime to determine the effects on human subjects. And this was done without the consent of those residents. Even today, we're finding more and more out about these experiments. Then there's energy burden. Lower income and renting families pay more in utilities. This is due mostly to poor insulation, air leaks, and outdated heating and cooling systems. Some families in St. Louis, believe it or not, pay $200 to $300 a month in utilities on the lower end, and others pay between $500 and $700 a month. To keep the lights on they cut back on food and medicine. Some resort to unsafe heating methods, such as the stove and the oven, leaving those on overnight. Others use space heaters that they place near the beds, and these have been known to cause fires in our area. So now let's get into this idea of environmental justice. This is the notion that communities shouldn't be forced to deal with these kinds of issues just because they belong to a certain race, a certain national origin, or an income bracket. These poor people tend to have less political capital than the industries that put them there, resulting in little or no protection from these environmental burdens. And America in the past has struggled to protect its most vulnerable populations and communities. In 1982, residents of Warren County mobilized against a plan to dump contaminated soil in their community in what's often credited as the first real environmental justice initiative. Later in the 80s, the EPA investigated 4 similar dump sites in southern states and found that all of these dump sites, all 4, were located in black, low-income neighborhoods. Later studies showed a similar thing: hazardous waste being dumped into minority communities. In 1992, George H.W. Bush founded the Office of Environmental Justice in the EPA. And in I forget the year, but later Clinton signed an executive order focused on requiring federal agencies to consider addressing environmental justice in all their policies, extending civil rights to environmental discrimination. However, no bills or laws were passed by Congress. George W. Bush removed the civil rights protections, instead focusing environmental justice on all people and not just those most affected by them. Without a federal environmental advocate for vulnerable populations, claims were rejected and delayed. During the Obama years, there was a recommitment, but it was never brought into effect. Despite Democrats controlling both houses of Congress and the presidency, no bills or laws were passed or introduced. And now, during our current administration, the Trump administration, not only is he seeking to weaken the environmental justice component of the EPA, but the EPA as a whole. But there are things we can do to help with this. We can demand justice. Some pillars of a comprehensive environmental justice policy would include demanding that all children or all people, regardless of race, have safe, affordable, energy-efficient housing. That we have air monitoring stations to ensure clean air and air quality management. And along with that monitoring, we develop comprehensive plans to address poor air quality. We need to make sure that everyone has reliable and affordable public transportation. In St. Louis, we have tried this in the past, but not all, but some majority white areas have advocated against expansion of public transportation, fearing that would lead to an influx of minority individuals and with that, crime in their communities. There is a town hall on the subject where many residents complained that expansion of the Metrolink or bus lines into their area would see African Americans and other minorities breaking into their houses, stealing their TVs, and carrying them back to the city on the trains or bus. We also need to advocate for healthy, fresh, accessible food. So right now, you may have heard the term food desert or food apartheid. There's a lack of fresh food available to low-income communities, causing them to go for unhealthy alternatives, nutrient-dense foods. This leads to chronic diet-based conditions like diabetes, hypertension, among others, to run rampant in these communities. And also, we need a neighborhood revitalization plan, plans to address the vacant buildings and illegal dumping. So here at CRC, we do a lot to address or mitigate some of the effects of environmental racism. Our weatherization program, where we go into low-income homes and we seal holes that we find. We put plastic on the windows so that the energy rates are lowered for those folks in the wintertime. We partner with various food pantries. We even, right now I'm sitting in our mitzvah garden. We grow fresh foods for low-income individuals so that they have access to nutrient-rich foods. We also support other food pantries like St. James, other food distribution centers. And I encourage more of you to do the same. Since literally the beginning of time, at least according to our core religious text, we are called on to be part of this ongoing work of creation. Bereshit compels us to never allow the destruction of our environment and to alleviate human suffering. And with that, I wish you all a happy holiday season. I hope that you use this time of reflection as we approach the new year and the days of awe to think about how we can make life better for other people, how we can right the wrongs of the past. So happy new year, everyone, and I hope to see you at some point when the building opens.